Dawson, November 1898. Breath hung in the air like smoke as the thermometer nailed to a log post read 38 below zero. While every miner in the Klondike raced to throw up the quickest, cheapest cabin before the killing cold arrived, one Norwegian immigrant named Ole Nilsen was still hauling river stones in late October. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He built two complete log walls, 70 spruce logs instead of the usual 35, spacing them exactly 12 inches apart. Then he spent 3 days dumping 2 tons of rounded river rock into that gap, stone by stone. Standard cabins measured 12 by 14 feet with single walls. Ole's stretched 14 by 18 with walls nearly 3 feet thick. Seattle Jack Moore shook his head. That's 2 cabins worth of timber for one roof. Thomas Hanley, the local authority who'd already wintered once in Dawson, insisted single walls do fine if you keep the stove roaring and burn 3 cords of wood a month. Then the deep cold hit. Temperatures plunged past 40 below and stayed there for weeks. Standard cabins bled heat so fast that men woke every 2 hours to feed their stoves, water buckets skinning with ice 3 feet from the fire. But Ole's cabin? At 3 in the morning, with no fire burning for 5 hours, it held 45 degrees while his neighbors shivered in the 20s. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about heat, stone, and survival that seasoned miners missed? And how did his excessive preparation prove to be the difference between sleeping through the night and freezing to death in the world's most unforgiving gold rush? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The September wind cut across the valley floor, carrying the scent of wood smoke and sawdust from a dozen half-built cabins scattered along Bonanza Creek. Ole Nilsen stood ankle-deep in yellow leaves, surveying his 14 by 18-foot footprint marked out with stakes and string. Around him, the Klondike's frantic construction season was reaching its peak, men racing against the calendar to throw up shelter before temperatures dropped past the point where axes bounced off frozen timber and mortar turned to ice in the bucket. His neighbors had already chinked their walls and were splitting kindling. Seattle Jack Moore, whose single-wall cabin sat barely 50 yards downstream, paused from banking earth around his foundation logs to shake his head at Ole's setup. The Norwegian had felled nearly 70 spruce logs, each 8 to 10 inches across, and peeled them clean with a draw knife until they gleamed pale yellow in the autumn sun. Most men used 35 to 40 logs for a complete cabin shell. Jack counted twice that number stacked in Ole's timber yard. "You building a cabin or a fort?" Jack called out, wiping sweat from his forehead. His own 12 by 14 structure followed the proven pattern. Single log walls notched tight at the corners, gaps stuffed with moss and clay, a steep-pitched roof to shed snow. 3 weeks of hard work had produced a snug shelter that would keep a man alive through the Yukon winter, assuming he kept his iron stove fed and his woodpile stocked. Ole looked up from scribing a foundation log, his scribe compass still pressed against the timber. "Building for the cold that's coming," he said simply. "This isn't coastal Norway. This is 40 below for months." That earned him another headshake from Jack, who'd spent enough time in Washington logging camps to know that any wall thick enough to stop wind would do the job. Thomas Hanley, the Ontario veteran who'd already survived one Klondike winter and appointed himself the creek's unofficial building authority, walked over to examine Ole's foundation layout. The parallel rows of sill logs confused him. "What's this double-track business?" Hanley asked, nudging one of the outer sill logs with his boot. Ole had laid 2 complete foundation rectangles, 14 feet apart on the short sides and 18 feet apart on the long sides, connected by cross ties every 4 feet like railroad track. "You can't be thinking of building 2 separate walls." Ole straightened up, brushing wood chips from his wool pants. 2 walls 12 inches apart fill the gap with stone. The silence stretched long enough for the sound of hammering from other cabins to echo off the valley walls. Hanley stared at the foundation layout as if Ole had just proposed building a cathedral. "That's 2 cabins worth of logs for one roof," he said finally. and stone don't burn. Stone won't keep you warm. Stone holds heat, Ole replied. My grandfather built heating stoves from field stone and brick. Fire them hot for 2 hours, they warm the house all night. He gestured toward the Yukon River, where rounded stones the size of bread loaves lay scattered along the bank. Heat the stone. Stone heats the room, even when the fire dies. Hanley's experience told him this was overcomplicated nonsense. He'd supervised bunkhouse construction in lumber camps, where temperatures regularly dropped to 20 below, and the formula was simple: tight walls, hot stove, plenty of wood. A single log wall 8 inches thick, properly chinked, would stop wind and hold enough heat to keep coffee liquid overnight. Adding stone was dead weight that served no purpose except to waste time and labor when both were running short. I've wintered here once already, Hanley said, crossing his arms. Standard cabin works fine if you keep the stove going and burn 3 cords a month. You're making work for yourself that don't need doing. But Ole had seen his grandfather's masonry heater in the family's timber house near Bergen, a massive stone and brick construction that could take the chill off 4 rooms with a single firing. He'd helped his uncle Eric build retaining walls using the same crib and fill method, parallel timber frames packed with stone to create structures that outlasted the men who built them. The principle was sound. Wood provided structure, stone provided mass, and mass stored heat like a battery. Over the next week, while his neighbors applied final chinking and installed stovepipes, Ole began raising his twin walls. The inner and outer shells rose together course by course, with rough-hewn spacer blocks maintaining the 12-inch gap. Every third course, he notched cross ties into both walls, creating a horizontal crib that would hold the stone infill without bulging outward under pressure. The work drew spectators. Men would pause on their way to and from the diggings to watch Ole notch logs for a wall system none of them had seen before. Patrick O'Rourke, the Irish foreman managing a 10-man crew downstream, brought his whole team to examine the construction during their dinner break. It's like shipbuilding, O'Rourke admitted, running his hand along one of the cross ties. Double hull with ballast. But he shook his head at the labor involved. My boys need shelter in 3 weeks. Not 3 months. Ole worked steadily through the questions and commentary. By the first week of October, his twin walls stood 6 feet high, and he began the stone-filling process that would define the next phase of mockery. Using a wheelbarrow borrowed from the creek's sluice operation, he hauled load after load of river stones from the Yukon bank, rounded granite and quartzite pieces that had tumbled smooth in glacial runoff, each weighing 4 to 8 pounds. The stones went into the wall gap in layers, largest pieces first to create a stable base, smaller stones wedged into the gaps to eliminate air pockets. Ole worked methodically, occasionally pouring buckets of coarse sand between stones to fill the finest spaces. By his estimate, the completed walls would hold close to 3 tons of stone, a thermal mass that dwarfed anything his neighbors were building. Fool's work, Hanley declared, as Ole dumped another wheelbarrow load into the north wall. All that stone, and you still need to burn wood to heat it. Might as well stack cordwood in there instead. But Ole remembered the physics his uncle Eric had explained during those long winter evenings in Bergen. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, smoothing the wild temperature swings that made frontier cabins comfortable at 9 in the evening and frigid by dawn. A hot fire would charge his stone core like a battery, and that stored heat would radiate inward for hours after the flames died. As October snow began dusting the valley and morning temperatures dropped toward the teens, Ole installed his iron stove near the center of his cabin and ran the stovepipe through a short brick surround he'd built into the back wall. The bricks would catch additional heat from the flue and dump it into the stone core, ensuring that every BTU from his firewood went toward charging his thermal mass rather than escaping up the chimney. His neighbors, snug in their completed cabins and burning their first serious fires of the season, shook their heads as Ole worked by lantern light to place the final stones. Winter was coming, and the fool with 2 walls was still building while smart men were splitting kindling and banking their foundations with earth and snow. The thermometer nailed to Seattle Jack's cabin wall read minus 43 degrees on the morning of November 15th, 1898. Ice crystals hung motionless in the still air, as if the cold had frozen the very atmosphere solid. Along Bonanza Creek, thin ribbons of smoke rose straight up from a dozen stovepipes, marking the locations of cabins whose occupants had been feeding fires since 4 in the morning just to keep coffee from freezing in the pot. Jack Moore stood in his doorway, breath clouding around his face as he studied the mercury line that had barely moved above minus 30 for the past week. His single-wall cabin had performed exactly as Thomas Hanley predicted through October and early November, tight enough to stop wind, warm enough to sleep in as long as the iron stove stayed fed. But this deep cold was testing every gap in his chinking and every joint in his log work. At 9 the previous evening, with the stove roaring and fresh split spruce crackling in the firebox, his cabin had reached a comfortable 65 degrees. By midnight, when he'd loaded the stove one final time before sleep, the temperature at bunk level still held near 60. But by 3 in the morning, the fire had burned down to coals, and Jack woke to find his water bucket skinned with ice, despite sitting just 6 feet from the stove. The alcohol thermometer he'd tacked to the wall above his bunk read 28 degrees. He wasn't alone in this pattern. Every man on the creek was learning the same brutal arithmetic. A standard log cabin with 8-inch walls shed heat so rapidly that maintaining livable temperatures required constant attention. Patrick O'Rourke's 10-man bunkhouse, built with the same single-wall method but scaled larger, had become a rotation of night firemen who took turns every 2 hours to keep the central stove burning hot enough to prevent frostbite among the sleeping miners. The wind picked up around noon, cutting down the valley with a sound like distant freight trains, and Jack felt his cabin walls flex slightly under the pressure. Where his chinking had dried and shrunk, tiny drafts found their way through the gaps, carrying interior heat away and replacing it with air so cold it seemed to burn his lungs. He stuffed rags into the worst cracks and moved his bunk closer to the stove, but the fundamental problem remained. His walls simply couldn't hold heat against this level of sustained cold. 200 yards upstream, Ole Nilsson was experiencing an entirely different winter. His thick-walled cabin had settled into a steady thermal rhythm that seemed to mock the conventional wisdom of his neighbors. Each evening, he fired his stove hard for 90 minutes, loading split spruce until the iron surfaces glowed dull red and the stone-filled walls began their slow process of heat absorption. The difference became apparent by 10 o'clock, when Ole's interior walls felt warm to the touch, while Jack's cabin walls, just beyond the stove's immediate radiation zone, remained cold enough to condense breath. At midnight, when both men banked their fires for the night, Ole's cabin held 68 degrees, 3 degrees warmer than Jack's, despite burning roughly the same amount of wood. But the real divergence appeared at dawn. While Jack woke to interior temperatures in the 20s and spent his first conscious minutes rebuilding his fire from cold ashes, Ole's cabin retained enough residual heat that he could dress without gloves and boil coffee before bothering to relight his stove. The alcohol thermometer above his bunk consistently read between 42 and 46 degrees after 8 hours without fire, a performance that defied every assumption about log cabin heating. The physics behind this difference lay hidden within Ole's stone-filled walls, where 3 tons of thermal mass were absorbing heat during the evening firing and releasing it slowly through the night. While Jack's thin log walls radiated their stored heat into the frigid air within hours, Ole's stone core acted like a massive battery, charged by the evening fire and discharged gradually until dawn. The 12-inch gap between his inner and outer log shells created an additional barrier to heat loss, trapping warm air that would otherwise escape through gaps and joints. Thomas Hanley, whose authority on cabin construction was being quietly undermined by Ole's consistent results, attempted to explain the difference through wood consumption. Norwegians burning more fuel than he admits, Hanley told anyone who would listen. No way to keep a cabin that warm without feeding the stove all night. But Sarah McLean's ledger told a different story. The Scottish shopkeeper who sold firewood by the cord and kept meticulous records of every transaction noted that Ole's monthly purchases ran consistently lower than his neighbors. While Jack and the other single wall cabin owners burned through nearly 3 cords of split spruce per month, Oles' consumption held steady at around 2.5 cords, a difference that represented real money in a place where delivered firewood cost $8 per cord. The cold deepened as November stretched toward December. Morning temperatures dropped below -45, and afternoon highs barely climbed above -20. Jack found himself waking 4 times each night to feed his stove, catching fragments of sleep between firing cycles that left him exhausted and irritable. His cabin's interior temperature swung wildly between the low 60s when the stove ran hot and the mid-20s when the fire died to coals. O'Rourke's bunkhouse faced an even more serious crisis. With 10 men generating body heat and moisture, the building's single walls couldn't prevent condensation from freezing on the interior surfaces. Ice formed along the baseboards and in the corners, creating slick patches that made movement hazardous and reducing the effective interior space as frozen moisture accumulated. The constant cycling between hot and cold was taking a toll on both the building and its occupants. Meanwhile, Oles' cabin maintained its steady performance. His evening firing routine had evolved into a precise ritual: load the stove with dry spruce, open the dampers wide to create a hot, fast burn that drove maximum heat into the stone core, then close the dampers once the rocks had absorbed their thermal charge. The result was a building that held comfortable sleeping temperatures through the deepest cold the Klondike could deliver. By the end of November, word of the temperature difference had spread beyond Bonanza Creek. Men working claims along El Dorado and Hunker Creeks began asking questions about the Norwegians' stone-filled walls, and a few practical miners started calculating whether the extra labor of double wall construction might be worth the fuel savings and improved comfort. The conventional wisdom was failing, and everyone knew it. But admitting that the fool's method worked better than accepted practice would require more than just acknowledging superior results. It would mean rethinking everything they thought they knew about surviving the world's harshest gold rush winter. December arrived with a vengeance that caught even the most experienced Klondike veterans off guard. For 14 consecutive days, the mercury never climbed above -20 degrees, and on 3 separate nights, the thermometer bottomed out at -47, temperatures that made exposed skin freeze solid in under 2 minutes and turned breath into ice crystals that tinkled like broken glass when they hit the ground. Seattle Jack Moore's carefully calculated wood supply began disappearing at an alarming rate. He'd stacked 6 cords of split spruce in October, assuming Thomas Hanley's estimate of 3 cords per month would carry him through the worst of winter. But the relentless cold was forcing him to burn nearly 4 cords per month just to maintain survivable temperatures, and his dwindling woodpile represented a potentially fatal miscalculation. Worse, the nearest standing timber lay nearly 2 miles upstream, buried under 4 feet of snow that had turned simple wood cutting into an exhausting, dangerous expedition. The structural weaknesses of conventional cabin construction began manifesting in ways that went beyond mere discomfort. Jack's chinking, which had seemed adequate in October, contracted in the severe cold until gaps appeared along every horizontal log joint. Wind found these openings and exploited them ruthlessly, creating drafts that made his cabin feel like a sieve. No matter how much wood he burned, cold air infiltrated faster than his stove could heat the replacement air. His neighbor's situation had deteriorated even further. The Ontario miner in the cabin closest to the creek had watched his roof develop an ice dam that eventually caused a partial ceiling collapse, dumping snow and frozen debris onto his sleeping area during a particularly brutal night when temperatures hit -45. The man had spent the rest of that night huddled in Oles' cabin, grateful for shelter that stayed above freezing, even with 6 people crowded inside. Patrick O'Rourke's 10-man bunkhouse faced the most serious crisis. The building's single log walls, stressed by constant temperature cycling and the moisture generated by multiple occupants, had developed structural problems that threatened the entire crew's survival. Chinking fell out in chunks, leaving gaps that whistled with wind. Ice formations along the interior walls grew thicker each night, reducing the usable space and creating conditions that made sleep nearly impossible. The breaking point came on December 8th, when O'Rourke's central stovepipe joint separated during the night. Expansion and contraction from repeated heating and cooling had loosened the connection enough that smoke began pouring into the bunkhouse instead of venting outside. The crew faced an impossible choice: breathe smoke all night or extinguish their fire when the outside temperature read minus 38 degrees. They chose to douse the fire, and by morning, 3 men showed early signs of frostbite while the rest huddled together for warmth in temperatures that had dropped to 15 degrees inside the building. O'Rourke made the decision that probably saved his crew's lives. He marched all 10 men through knee-deep snow to Ole's cabin and asked for emergency shelter. Ole's stone-walled cabin faced its ultimate test that night. 11 men packed into a space designed for 2, with body heat and respiration creating moisture levels that would have turned a conventional cabin into a steam bath followed by an ice cave. But the thick walls and thermal mass core absorbed the excess humidity while maintaining steady temperatures that kept everyone comfortable despite the crowding. The contrast became undeniable when O'Rourke borrowed Sarah McLean's spare thermometer to conduct a direct comparison. On the night of December 10th, with outside temperatures holding steady at minus 41 degrees, both cabins were fired identically with the same amount of split spruce loaded at 8 o'clock in the evening. The fires in both stoves were allowed to burn down naturally, with no additional fuel added after 10 o'clock. Jack's single-wall cabin heated to 62 degrees. At bedtime, dropped to 54 degrees by midnight, 41 degrees by 2 in the morning, and 32 degrees by 6 o'clock, a total heat loss of 30 degrees over 10 hours. More critically, the interior temperature had fallen below the freezing point of water, meaning that coffee, wash water, and even the men themselves were in danger of freezing solid. Ole's stone core cabin, starting at the same 62 degrees, dropped to 58 degrees by midnight, 51 degrees by 2 in the morning, and held at 44 degrees at 6 o'clock, a heat loss of only 18 degrees over the same period. The difference represented the margin between sleeping through the night and waking every 2 hours to prevent death from exposure. The physics behind this performance gap lay in the fundamental properties of thermal mass and heat transfer. Jack's cabin walls, composed entirely of wood with minimal mass, absorbed heat quickly, but released it just as quickly once the heat source was removed. His 8-inch log walls acted like a thin shell that provided minimal thermal storage, forcing the interior temperature to track closely with the dying fire. Ole's walls functioned as a completely different system. The 3 tons of stone packed between his inner and outer log shells absorbed heat throughout the evening firing and released it gradually over the following 8 to 10 hours. The stone's thermal mass smoothed out the temperature swings that made conventional cabins comfortable at bedtime and deadly by dawn, creating a steady heat source that continued working long after the fire had burned to ash. Even the pattern of heat loss differed dramatically between the two systems. Jack's cabin shed heat at a rate of roughly 8 degrees per hour during the critical overnight period, while Ole's thick walls limited heat loss to approximately 3 degrees per hour. Over a full night, this difference accumulated into the 18-degree temperature gap that separated comfortable sleep from life-threatening exposure. O'Rourke, whose construction experience included railroad camps and logging operations across northern Canada, recognized the implications immediately. "It's like comparing a tin cup to a brick oven," he told his crew as they prepared to return to their repaired bunkhouse. "Tin heats fast and cools fast. Brick heats slow and cools slow. When you're trying to make heat last all night, you want the brick." By mid-December, 3 more miners had approached Ole with requests for advice on retrofitting their existing cabins. The Norwegian's success had moved beyond mere curiosity into the realm of survival necessity, and men who had mocked his wasteful construction methods 6 weeks earlier were now asking him to teach them the principles of thermal mass and heat storage that made the difference between sleeping and freezing in the Klondike's harshest winter on record. The formal experiment began on December 20th, when Seattle Jack Moore walked to Sarah McLean's store and purchased a second alcohol thermometer for $8, nearly a full day's wages, but a necessary investment in settling the question that was keeping him awake at night. Thomas Hanley had agreed to participate in what they called the cabin test, partly from scientific curiosity, but mostly because his own heating bills were bankrupting him at current wood prices. They established simple rules. Both cabins would be fired identically starting at 7 in the evening, using split spruce from the same cord to eliminate variables in wood quality and moisture content. Each stove would receive exactly 40 pounds of fuel loaded in two 20-pound charges an hour apart. At 9 o'clock, both fires would be banked with ash and allowed to burn down naturally with no additional fuel until morning. Ole agreed to the comparison with the quiet confidence of a man whose heating system had already proven itself through weeks of brutal testing. Jack's single wall cabin and Ole's stone core design sat less than 200 yards apart, eliminating wind and elevation variables that might skew the results. Both structures faced the same northwest exposure and dealt with identical outdoor conditions. The first measurement at 9 o'clock showed both cabins holding steady at 64 degrees, confirming that their stoves were performing equally and their initial heat loads were identical. By 11 o'clock, the first significant divergence appeared. Jack's cabin had dropped to 56 degrees while Ole's read 59, a 3-degree difference that seemed minor but represented the beginning of dramatically different heat loss curves. At 1 in the morning, with both fires reduced to glowing coals and outside temperatures holding at minus 36 degrees, the gap had widened to 7 degrees. Jack's thermometer read 48 degrees while Ole's showed 55. More importantly, Jack could feel the cold pressing in around the edges of his cabin as drafts found their way through chinking gaps and log joints while Ole's thick walls continued radiating stored heat from their stone core. By 3 o'clock, the difference had become unmistakable. Jack's cabin registered 41 degrees and falling, cold enough that his breath began misting and water droplets on his table showed the first signs of surface tension changes that preceded freezing. Ole's cabin held steady at 52 degrees, warm enough that men could work with bare hands, and coffee remained liquid without additional heating. The final measurement at 6 in the morning revealed the full scope of the performance gap that had been building all winter. Jack's cabin bottomed out at 34 degrees, just 2 degrees above the freezing point of water. Ice had formed in his wash basin, and frost feathers decorated the interior surfaces of his log walls where warm, moist air had condensed and frozen during the night. Ole's cabin, stabilized at 46 degrees, a 12-degree advantage that represented the difference between waking up comfortable and waking up in immediate danger of hypothermia. His stone walls remained warm to the touch, continuing to radiate the heat they had absorbed during the evening firing. No ice formed anywhere inside his cabin, and the interior humidity levels stayed comfortable rather than creating the dangerous freeze-thaw cycles that plagued conventional construction. The mathematical reality of heat loss rates became clear when they calculated the hourly temperature drops. Jack's cabin shed heat at an average rate of 3.5 degrees per hour during the critical 6-hour period from midnight to dawn, when outdoor temperatures were at their lowest and interior heat sources were exhausted. Ole's cabin lost heat at just 2 degrees per hour over the same period, a seemingly small difference that accumulated into a survival advantage over the course of a full night. Thomas Hanley, faced with data that contradicted everything he thought he knew about frontier heating, attempted one final defense of conventional wisdom. "Wood burns the same in both stoves," he argued. "If his cabin stays warmer, he's got to be using more fuel somehow." But Sarah McLean's purchasing records provided objective evidence that demolished this explanation. Her ledger showed Ole buying 2.25 cords of split wood per month, while Jack and the other single-wall cabin owners purchased between 3 and 3.5 cords for the same period. Ole's superior heating performance came with a fuel savings of roughly 30%, making his system both more comfortable and more economical. The practical implications of these results spread quickly along Bonanza Creek. Patrick O'Rourke, whose crew had experienced the limitations of conventional construction firsthand, became the first to request detailed construction guidance. Ole walked him through the fundamental principles that made thermal mass heating work in extreme cold conditions. The key lay in understanding heat as something that could be stored rather than simply generated. Conventional cabin thinking focused on producing enough heat to overcome cold, requiring constant fuel consumption to maintain temperature. Ole's approach treated heat as a resource that could be captured during peak burning periods and released gradually when the fire died, dramatically extending the useful energy from each piece of firewood. The stone infill served as the thermal battery at the heart of this system. During evening firing, when the stove ran hot and the cabin temperature climbed into the 60s, the 3 tons of rock absorbed excess heat that would otherwise be wasted through the roof and walls. This stored energy remained available for release throughout the night, maintaining livable temperatures long after the fire had burned to ash. O'Rourke immediately saw applications beyond individual cabins. His 10-man crew needed a heating solution that could warm a large space efficiently while requiring minimal overnight attention. A scaled-up version of Ohley's thermal mass principle could solve both problems simultaneously. Working together, they designed a retrofit system for the damaged bunkhouse that incorporated the most effective elements of stone core heating without requiring complete reconstruction. They built interior crib walls 4 feet high and 8 feet long around the central stove area, creating thermal mass reservoirs that could be filled with river stone and heated directly by radiant energy from the iron stove surfaces. The retrofit installation took 5 days of hard work, but the results proved worth the effort. The bunkhouse thermal mass system reduced overnight temperature swings by nearly 15 degrees while cutting fuel consumption by approximately 25%. 10 men could sleep through the night without designated firemen, and morning temperatures stayed above 40 degrees, even when outdoor conditions dropped below -30. Word of these successes reached claims along Eldorado and Hunker Creeks, where miners dealing with similar heating crises began asking detailed questions about stone core construction techniques. The Fool's method was becoming the preferred solution for anyone who valued warmth, fuel economy, and uninterrupted sleep during the Klondike's most brutal winter in recorded history. By the spring of 1899, the thermal mass heating method that had begun with Ole Nielsen's foolish double walls had evolved into the accepted standard for serious cold weather construction throughout the northern goldfields. The shift from ridicule to adoption happened gradually, then suddenly, as miners who had survived their first Klondike winter shared hard-earned lessons with the next wave of stampeders arriving from southern ports. Patrick O'Rourke became the primary evangelist for stone core heating after his crew's near-fatal experience with conventional construction. His retrofit project had worked so well that word spread to other large-scale operations, and by February, he was consulting on bunkhouse heating systems for crews as far away as Nome and Circle City. The Irish foreman's practical approach to explaining thermal mass principles made the technique accessible to men who understood machines and systems, but had never considered heat as something that could be stored like water in a barrel. O'Rourke's teaching method focused on familiar analogies that resonated with miners and construction crews. He compared stone-filled walls to the thermal behavior of mining equipment they already understood. Think of your boiler staying warm hours after you bank the fire, he would explain to foremen planning new construction. Stone walls work the same way. Heat them up during evening firing. They give that heat back all night long. It's like having a second stove that burns no wood. The systematic documentation of construction techniques began when Sarah McLean convinced Ole to draw detailed plans for a merchant in Dawson who wanted to build the territory's first stone core commercial building. The Norwegian's careful measurements and step-by-step instructions became the foundation for a construction manual that McLean distributed to builders throughout the region, turning individual innovation into teachable methodology. The manual specified exact dimensions for effective thermal mass installations: outer and inner log shells spaced exactly 12 inches apart, cross ties notched into both walls every 4 feet to prevent bulging stone infill consisting of pieces between 4 and 8 inches in diameter for optimal packing density and heat transfer. Most critically, it detailed the stove placement and heat distribution techniques that made the difference between a warm cabin and merely an insulated one. By 1899, modified versions of Ole's technique were appearing in mining camps across Alaska and northern Canada. The basic principle proved adaptable to different materials and construction methods while maintaining its essential effectiveness. In areas where river stone was scarce, builders used brick, broken concrete, or even carefully packed gravel to create thermal mass cores that delivered similar performance improvements. Thomas Hanley, whose initial skepticism had been thoroughly demolished by measured temperature comparisons, became one of the technique's most effective advocates precisely because of his former opposition. Men who might have dismissed Ol's claims as Norwegian eccentricity listened carefully when the respected Ontario veteran explained why conventional heating had failed during the emergency and how thermal mass offered a superior solution. Hanley's conversion narrative became a standard part of explaining the method to newcomers. "I thought I knew cold weather building because I'd survived lumber camps and railroad construction," he would tell prospective builders. "But lumber camp cold and Klondike cold are different animals entirely. At -40 for weeks at a time, you need more than just tight walls and a hot stove. You need walls that work with you instead of against you." The economic advantages of stone core heating became impossible to ignore as fuel costs remained high throughout the gold rush period. Men using Ol's method consistently burned 30 to 40% less wood than their neighbors, while maintaining superior interior comfort levels. In a region where delivered firewood cost $8 to $12 per cord, this fuel savings translated into significant money that could be invested in mining equipment, better food, or passage home to families. The technique's spread accelerated when established contractors began incorporating thermal mass principles into commercial construction projects. The first stone core hotel opened in Dawson during the summer of 1899, featuring guest rooms that stayed comfortable with minimal heating and common areas that retained warmth throughout the night without constant stoking. The building's success demonstrated that thermal mass heating worked at scale and could support business operations that depended on consistent environmental control. Mining companies operating large-scale hydraulic and dredging operations adopted modified versions of the heating system for equipment shelters and maintenance facilities. Buildings that housed sensitive machinery or required year-round access benefited enormously from the stable temperatures that thermal mass construction provided. Compressed air equipment, steam engines, and precision tools all perform better in environments where temperature swings were minimized through stored heat rather than constant firing. The validation of Ol's approach represented more than individual vindication. It demonstrated that immigrant knowledge systems, when properly applied, could solve problems that conventional frontier methods could not address effectively. Norwegian traditions of thermal mass heating, adapted to available materials and extreme conditions, had created a building system that outperformed accepted American practices in measurable, significant ways. The legacy of the Klondike thermal mass innovation extended far beyond the gold rush period. 20th century Arctic construction manuals would reference stone core and double wall techniques as proven methods for extreme cold climates. Modern passive solar design incorporates the same principles of thermal mass and heat storage that Ol pioneered in his riverside cabin during the winter of 1898. The fundamental lesson endured through decades of technological change. In extreme environments, traditional knowledge adapted with practical intelligence consistently outperforms newer methods that ignore basic physical principles. The fool, who built 2 walls and filled the gap with stones, had proven that understanding heat, mass, and time could triumph over conventional wisdom, raw fuel consumption, and the accepted practices of men who thought they knew better.